You're listening to the Doctor Is In podcast, brought to you by MartinClinic.com. During the episode, the doctors share a lot of information. As awesome as the info may be, it is not intended to diagnose, cure, treat, or prevent any disease. It's strictly for informational purposes.
Okay, let's talk about another wrong concept. The other day we talked about eating lots of fruit is actually good for you, and we sort of put a little damper on fruit and not to overdo it primarily because of uric acid. Let's look at another one. Eating a multitude of times a day is good for you. Again, this popular theory started back in, I think in the 1970s when I actually was in school, because one of the things that came out in those days you literally had to bring a physician to a dentist and drill their teeth without anesthetic for them to believe there was a condition called hypoglycemia. Now, they understood hyperglycemia, which, of course, is high levels of blood sugar, diabetes. Doctors in the 70s understood that, but they really questioned whether there was such a thing as hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. And now, of course, it is well established that there is such a thing as low blood sugar. And actually, hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia are two sides, it's a coin with two sides to it. Because really, it's a problem of insulin. If you have insulin resistance, you often will have trouble with hyperglycemia, but for a lot of people, they have trouble with hypoglycemia, and the cure to that, or at least the management of that, was to eat frequently. But again, times have changed. We live in a different world. We live in where people are eating so many crappy carbohydrates and lots of sugar. Yes, they can go into hypoglycemia, but the actual cure for hypoglycemia is to get your insulin down. So if the insulin comes down, insulin resistance comes down, then you actually can correct hypoglycemia. I've suffered with hypoglycemia, just because, again, I got bad genetics for diabetes in the family. And, I remember having bouts, pretty severe bouts of low blood sugar. And I didn't, I didn't even recognize it until I ate. I think I did a glass of juice or something, or had an orange or something, and actually felt better immediately. So there is such a thing as hypoglycemia, but be very, very careful today about eating frequently. Because again, we're carboholics. The vast majority of the population have trouble with carbohydrates. They eat way too many of them. And for a couple of reasons, I want to talk about that. Every time you eat, you need that hormone insulin. Insulin is a food hormone, simple as that. If you don't eat, you don't need insulin. And because the vast majority of people are metabolically challenged and they have trouble with insulin resistance, or at the Martin Clinic, we call it high circulating insulin, every time you eat, you need insulin. So this is why we like intermittent fasting. Now, for some people, they don't do well with intermittent fasting, or it takes them a while to get to a point where they can fast. So every time you do intermittent fasting, you actually are not secreting insulin. So every time you eat, you need insulin. Now remember, insulin is a fat storing hormone. If you have insulin present in your bloodstream, you cannot get rid of fat. It's just impossible because insulin is a fat storing hormone. Secondly, it creates inflammation. So the more you use insulin, the more insulin creates inflammation. And we know that inflammation is detrimental. Inflammation is detrimental to your blood vessels, to your cells, especially to the little capillaries which connect your arteries and veins, and they get damaged. That's why diabetics have so much trouble with circulation. Inflammation is very, very damaging to blood vessels. This is why, again, if you do the reset, a lot of people find when they eat no carbs for 4 weeks and live on eggs, meat, and cheese, that they can implement even intermittent fasting, because the nutrients that they're eating in the eggs, meat, and cheese really, really give them the best octane, and it's so nutrient dense. So a lot of times hypoglycemia is created because people are carboholics. They're eating way too much sugar, and that blood sugar fluctuates so much. So one of the cures for that is to eat the right foods less frequently. Now, if you're eating eggs, meat, and cheese, usually you're not hungry. You won't get those swings in your blood sugar. So this is very, very effective.
You've reached the end of another Doctor is In podcast with your hosts, Dr. Martin Jr. and Sr. Be sure to catch our next episode, and thanks for listening.